So the other part of a market is supply. And these are your specification objectives. So again, a definition of supply and knowing what it means, knowing the definition of producer surplus, and also how to draw the diagram and show price changes, what happens to the producer surplus. Understanding factors that are going to shift supply, that are non-price factors, and being able to tell the difference between a shift in supply and a movement along a supply curve. So supply, very similar definition to that you had for demand, but rather than thinking of consumers here, we're thinking of producers. So the quantity of a product that producers are willing and able to provide at various prices over a period of time. And what's really important is to think about, when we think about supply, is what are the suppliers, the producers, that is, what are they actually interested in? And when we think about businesses, I mean, they'll have lots of different interests and lots of different reasons for existing, but one of the main unifying features may be that they're looking for profit. And that's quite important when we look at the shape of a supply curve. So what we tend to find is, if I ask the question about, if you were a business, how many of you would supply your products for this amount, and so we had 10 different people representing 10 different businesses, this is what we tend to get, a distribution. Probably not exactly like this, but something along those lines. And so we find that supply is actually upward sloping. And when we think back to profit, why does that happen? It's because businesses think that the more I supply my product for, the more chance I have of making profit. So that's pretty logical, because there'll be a difference between the price and the cost, and the higher the price is above the cost. I mean, we're assuming here that the cost would stay kind of equal. The higher the price is above that cost, the more profit you make. So more producers are willing to get out of bed and make sandwiches when there's a higher price. So here we've got, sorry, I've just noticed on the bottom of the diagram it just said quantity demanded. It should say quantity supplied. But here we've got at price 1, the quantity willing to be supplied is Q1, which is a price of £2. There's 4 producers willing to supply here, or the quantity supplied of sandwiches, 4 sandwiches supplied to the market. And if you increase the price, you get a greater quantity being supplied. So that is showing on that diagram a movement along the supply curve. So a change in the price causes a movement along the supply curve. As you'll see in the equilibrium presentation, that movement along your supply curve is actually caused by a shift in demand. So all those factors that we talked about in the demand presentation, change in consumer income, or positive change in taste and fashion. I'm just thinking of, demand shifting outwards here for this diagram. So a positive change in taste and fashion, or population growth, or positive change in the weather, the type of weather that would increase the demand, the demand for sandwiches. And what else? We could have a fall in the price of a complement, or an increase in the price of a substitute. So that would cause demand to shift outwards, and that would cause a movement along your supply curve. And then we have the same with demand when we're looking at the consumer surplus, but this time we're looking at it from the point of view of the business. So we're looking at what we call the producer surplus. And a tip, when you're looking at producer surplus, make your life easy for yourself. Just draw supply, because if you draw demand, technically it would be it would be the correct diagram. It's not incorrect, but it just makes everything a lot more complicated and more likely to make mistakes, especially when you're stressed in an exam. So producer surplus, just draw your supply curve, and it's the difference between the price a producer is willing to accept and what is actually paid. So what is actually paid is the equilibrium price there. So it's that shape, that triangle below that price. That is the producer surplus. And you're likely to get a question on this. If you do get a question in the exam, you're likely to get a question on a change in the price. How does that affect the producer surplus? So on the left-hand side, here we have an increase in the price, and you've got your original producer surplus, this triangle here, and then if you increase the price, you've got an additional producer surplus up here. So you've got to get creative with cross-hatching here. And then if you have a decrease, this triangle here would be the original producer surplus. You can see my lines go fully down there. And then you have this bottom triangle there, which is the new producer surplus if the price decreases. So there's fewer suppliers willing to supply at that decreased price. That's why you've got a lower producer surplus. So to be honest, if I was going to label this again, I'd just label this half trapeze shape of above here the loss in producer surplus, and I'd label that one the new one. But I'd change original producer surplus to loss in producer surplus. I think that would be a little bit clearer. Okay, so what causes supply to shift? So we know that a change in price, aka a shift in demand, will cause a movement along your supply curve. But what actually causes supply to shift inwards and outwards? We have these factors here, which I'll go through in order. So I call these SIGs. Change in cost of production, change in the industry size or nature, change in government policy, or a change in weather. Will it be SIG-W, so I'll call it seasons. So cost of production, I've got two photos here. Here's from about the 1950s, car manufacturing, and here we've got car manufacturing these days. It's much more efficient these days, better technology available, and that has meant that our supply has shifted outwards of car manufacturing. We can produce much more these days, more technologically advanced. So if your cost of production decrease or you get advances in technology, have I got a slide for that? Then you find that supply would shift outwards. However, on the left-hand side here, we've got an increase in the cost of production. So this might be caused by an increase in the cost of raw materials or labour costs, wage costs going up. So that would shift your supply inwards because you can produce less with the resources that you have. Whereas if your cost of production, maybe the wage rate decreases, maybe you can take on more workers and produce more, and maybe increase your output. Okay, industry. Industry is a bit of a funny one. It mentions it in the textbook, but it's actually a much more A2 topic. So in A2 we learn about things called monopolies, which is basically the aim of the game, board game Monopoly. I don't know if you've ever made it to the end of a game of Monopoly because it's pretty boring. But if you make it to the end of the game, it's because there's one person left in the game. They've monopolised the game. Mono, think of monobrow, it just means one, or monorail. So an industry that's a monopoly is where there's only one firm in the industry, whereas an opposite of that would be perfectly competitive or monopolistic competition. But this is all A2 stuff. So we can see, I could have drawn these a bit clearer actually, but if there are lots of competitors in the industry, we've got lots of supply is going to be out here somewhere. If there's a lack of competitors, so there's less supply, it's further inwards somewhere. But it's just to be aware of at this stage, it will come up in the A2. Government policy is another thing that can shift the supply curve. So here we have chancellors of the exchequer, or maybe when you're watching this presentation, I don't know, ex-chancellors maybe, I don't know. But we have chancellors making budget decisions, so the fiscal decisions for the economy, which is government spending and government taxation. So these things can shift supply, because basically these things will alter your cost of production. So if you put an indirect tax on something, it increases your cost of production, so that shifts supply inwards. If you put a subsidy, which is the opposite of an indirect tax, that decreases the cost of production, so that shifts supply outwards there. Okay, so here's your little summary of shifts in supply there, and I think, yeah, if we check, we've covered all the specification objectives.